Welcome to another episode of Always Ageless, where we bring you insights, stories, and expert advice to help you navigate life's transitions with confidence. Today's episode is especially an important one, especially for families, caregivers, and anyone working with seniors who may one day need to sell a home through a trust. When a loved one passes away, or transitions to another senior living arrangement, their home often becomes one of the biggest assets that the family must handle, as we all know. If that home is held in a trust, the selling process is completely different from a traditional sale, and it requires the knowledge and expertise of someone who knows how to handle that kind of a transition and that kind of a transaction. That's why today I am especially thrilled to welcome today's guest, Noelle Longmeyer, a highly respected trust real estate professional in Southern California. She happened to be located in Long Beach, Los Angeles County, but she can help you throughout in other areas, at least throughout the state of California, and she'll tell us about that. Noelle specializes in trust sales and has extensive experience working with seniors, their families, attorneys, financial advisors, and all of those that have to go through this kind of a transaction. They're not the same as probate sales, and Noelle is going to explain why, and I'm anxious to hear myself. So grab your coffee, your cup of tea. If you're driving, turn up your volume, and let's drive into today's episode of Always Ageless. Welcome, Noelle Longmeyer.
Thank you. I was so excited to come on your show, Valerie.
Well, we are glad to have you. Tell us, Noelle, let's start with some basics. What exactly is a trust sale, and how does it differ from a probate sale?
In lots of ways, it differs. A trust sale is essentially when a property is being sold and the trust is a legal entity that owns the property. It could be a revocable trust. It could be an irrevocable trust. It could be a living trust. There's lots of different types of trusts and how the property will be sold as a result of what type of a trust it is. It differs from probate in that it doesn't require a court confirmation. So there's no barrier to how quickly a sale can happen, and there's no additional fees associated like there are with probate. And the trustees of the trust can sell with authority. They have full authority to sell the property, and they don't have to go through any kind of a court process or legal process other than just the typical escrow type of a process to sell a home.
So why might a property be sold through a trust rather than going through a probate? What causes one or the other?
So if you don't, if you have a trust, that is it's a legal document that basically sets up the terms of how you want your estate to be settled in regard to a particular property. So if you have a single family home, if you have multiple properties, investment properties, commercial, whatever type of properties you can record those properties into the name of a trust. That's called funding the trust with an asset. If you fund the trust with an asset, that property will be under the protection of that legal entity. So let's say it's me, Noelle Longmeyer, and I buy a house. If I bought it in my name, I could transfer that property into the name of the trust and sell that property through the trust in the future. If I were to pass away, I name a successor trustee in the trust, and my successor trustee can sell the home without having to go through any kind of a court process after my passing through a trust. If I passed away and didn't have a trust and my property wasn't in a trust, my loved ones or whoever is going to be left to settle my estate would have to go through probate. And probate is a court process by which there's a referee that's assigned, there's a court process, and the average time frame to sell a property for your loved ones after you've passed is anywhere between 12 to 18 months before you can sell a property. And there's significant fees on top of that. So there's definitely a different process between selling a property through a trust and selling through probate.
So is it correct to say that selling it through a trust is kind of like a regular sale, except that the person you actually sell it to isn't the person who originally owned the home. Is that correct? So it's kind of like I own a home and then I pass away and my son is my successor trustee. Is that correct?
Yes,
So
you
he
can sell a
sells it.
property through a trust, whether if you're the living trustee, that's when we call it a revocable trust. A living trust is when you as the trustee are still alive and have complete control over what happens to your property. So you could still be the person that's pulling the strings, and you can sell that property even if it's in a trust if you haven't passed. It becomes an irrevocable trust if you were the one that set up the trust as the primary trustee and have passed. Your successor trustees would then be the ones that have to follow the wishes of the trust. It can't be changed after your passing. Prior to your passing, as the living trustee, you can do whatever you want. You can change it, you can amend it, you can add different successor trustees, you can do anything you want. But once you pass, it becomes typically an irrevocable trust. And then you would have a different person, whoever your successor trustees, they would be the person who are the authority signers, basically, that
And who's
sell the
managing
property.
the trust for you?
Correct.
Right. I
Yeah.
see. Okay. So what are the biggest misconceptions then that people have about trust sales?
I think a lot of times people think that they can record different types of deeds to protect their loved ones rather than set their home up in a trust. And there's a myth that if they add, let's say, for instance, I have children and I want to add my children onto title so that I can protect them. So that way, if I pass away, then the house will pass to them automatically. And they think that that's the best way of approaching things like that rather than going to the expense of setting up a trust. And sometimes people just don't know what the resources are to, how to set up a trust, who to reach out to. And so they think, okay, well, I'm just going to add whoever I want to protect onto my title. And they
Um,
don't realize that can become a very expensive and costly taxable event. When you add people to your title, you could be basically triggering different types of reassessments of that property at the current value, and it could create incredible tax liabilities for your loved ones down the road that you don't even realize. So that's a big difference between thinking about selling a property and trying to protect your loved ones through title by title issues versus setting up a trust and putting that property under the name of the trust.
yeah, that's true. And especially here in California,
Yeah.
because now there's so many new laws about taxation and property taxes and so forth. And so many things I'm thinking of that are triggered with a trust. And doesn't it seem that sometimes people don't realize, just to your point, that by putting somebody in a trust that or changing the name the property into a trust also triggers a type of ownership change, right?
Correct.
Like,
Yeah, it's a
so,
vesting change.
yeah. So
I'll
like
give
for
you I'll give you a really good example,
please
and I
do.
just ran into this with some clients recently. Um, there the there was a property kind of in the general LA area, and there was a mom on the property who was an elderly mother, and she had one son on title with her already. But rather than put the property in the trust, she decided at the very last minute to add the other two siblings to title through a quitclaim deed. And by doing that, it triggered a change in ownership. There's a form that goes every time you record any kind of new vesting to the property. There's a form that has to be filled out and should be filled out appropriately, and it wasn't filled out appropriately. And what it did is it triggered the county of Los Angeles to reassess the property value, and it tripled the property taxes from what they were. So that is one of the, if that's not a motivator to really be careful about how you approach, how you keep your property, and what kind of your title vesting you're going to have, how you vest your property. That's a really good lesson to learn from and benefit from rather than have to have that experience, because it made the property taxes unaffordable for their family.
And of course, then the county doesn't allow you to undo that
Correct.
because they know why you did it
Correct.
or undid it was to
Yeah.
avoid taxes.
There's really no undoing it.
Right. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, a couple things that I've seen lately are off the subject, but we want to go back just bring these up. A couple of things that people don't know is that I heard because of the fires recently that someone had put their home in the name of a trust. So the insurance company looked at it and said, okay, Noelle, you own the home. You think you own the home, but your title is in the name of the Noelle Trust. Therefore, the Noelle Trust is not insured.
Yes, this has been a very hot topic.
No pun intended.
Literally, it is not something that comes up as often, but because of the fires and because of how widespread the claims were and the impact on the insurance companies, they were looking for any way to try to get out of making, payment on claims. And that has come up. So if you do have a trust, there are certain things that you do want to think about. And a trust sale is a little different from a standard sale in that there is going to be a little bit more paperwork down the road, because if you're a living trust, if you have a living trust and you're the living trustee and you sell a property, it doesn't require more paperwork. You would sell it just as you would normally as an individual if you're selling a property. But if it's an irrevocable trust and you're the successor trustees, it will require you to do some additional things. First, like you just pointed out, make sure that the homeowner's insurance is in the name of the trust.
Yeah, absolutely.
Your homeowner's insurance policy should be in the name of the trust. And as a successor trustee, you need to have a bank account set up in the name of the trust.
Is that right?
Yes, have a bank account set up in the name of the trust, and you will also have to apply for an EIN number, an employer tax ID number. And that is because this is a legal entity. The trust becomes a legal entity that if you're a successor trustee, you're going to have to file a tax return for after you sell a property. So if I sell a property in 2025 under the name of a trust, as a successor trustee, I will need to file a tax return for that trust for 2025 to sell the estate.
Well, I'm sure those are some things that our listeners and our viewers never heard of. I didn't realize that about the tax return either. And another
Yep.
thing, which is off the subject, but while we're talking about trust and changes of ownership, for example, there are some situations where, as in one of our cities here, people have a permit to operate a short-term rental.
Yes.
And that's allowed, but that home isn't allowed to be sold and the permit go with it. So some of our owners put their homes in a trust. And that city then said, this home changed ownership.
Oh, yeah.
And you just lost your permit.
Oh, God. So maybe
And
the
people
permit should also be in the name of the trust when you get it. Yeah.
yes, so before you make any changes in your ownership,
Yeah.
as good as they may be, as positive it may be, make sure you consider all of these other things and make sure your insurance. After I heard that, I went home to my husband. I said, we have to change our insurance. But the problem now in California is that some insurance companies are looking for reasons to cancel you.
Yes.
So if you change your ownership, you might get canceled. So certainly these things are all very important. But let's get back to the subject of real estate and trusts.
Yeah.
How does a trust sale impact the timeline of the process of selling a home?
Well, in comparison to probate, which I mentioned earlier, it streamlines that process. As a trustee, you have the full authority to make decisions of when to sell the property, how much to sell the property for, and how fast the escrow process is going to be. That is completely within your control as a trustee or a successor trustee. If, for instance, someone passes away and they didn't have a trust, you would be subject to whatever the court backup is or backlog is through the probate courts in California. And I mentioned that timeline. On average, it takes between 12 to 18 months to sell a property through the probate process. And you do not have control over the exact amount that you're going to sell that property for, because they appoint a court referee to determine what the value of that property is based on the court's appraisal of the value of the property. And you don't get to necessarily choose who the buyer is going to be. You don't necessarily get to choose how fast the escrow process is going to be, and you will be at the mercy of the courts. So it definitely is an advantage to have a trust so that you can sell with full authority versus a probate sale, a traditional probate sale, which requires court confirmation.
I think you've answered our next question, but many seniors set up trusts to protect their assets. So how does having a trust in place benefit them and their heirs when it comes to selling a property, other than the not having a probate? Are there other things that come to mind that are of benefit to them?
I would say emotionally, the biggest thing is there's an emotional benefit to protecting your asset or in a trust, and that is for the benefit of the heirs, the successors of the estate. You're really doing an incredible service to your family by putting the property in a trust, because you give very specific instructions which you get to be sure that your family is going to carry out as far as your wishes. Who gets what portion of what, whether it's grandchildren, whether it's your direct children, whether it's estates. There's charitable giving through trusts. And if you have
Yeah.
your property, you can set that property up, to be part of your estate, and you can donate some of the proceeds of the sale to charitable giving institutions. So there's lots of different ways that it benefits you and your loved ones, but ultimately it does help to take away some of the stress of how the estate is going to be settled. When your loved ones are left after your passing to deal with not only the grief of your loss, to add on the court process on top of that, and to figure out how to go through probate, hiring an attorney for probate, having to go through not knowing exactly how you wanted the estate to be settled, and the infighting that can happen
Yeah.
between siblings, between grandchildren, between other family members, that gets put to rest if your trust has been well written and clear about what the directions are for how you wanted your estate to be settled. Then there's not as much infighting. Then it really is a
Right.
much kinder, gentler process for your family to move forward and settle that estate.
And when someone inherits a home that's in the trust, what are some of the first steps that they should take to prepare for selling it?
Well, the first thing you're going to have to do, I'd say predominantly, part of the sales process is you're going to have to get death certificates. First thing you're
Okay.
going to have to do is order, I would say, a minimum of 10 to 12 death certificates, because that's going to be required. When you sell a property, you'll have to prove that you are the legal successor trustee through a death certificate. So you'll have to be able to provide a death certificate to the escrow officer, to the title
Mm.
company, all of the entities that are going to be involved in a sale that will approve the sale and allow clear title to pass will need a death certificate. And you'll need to have a certified copy of your trust. So have a full copy of the trust somewhere that you can provide to the escrow holder. You will have to be, because you're going to be signing affidavits and certifications of trusts as well, but have a full copy, because you need that full copy to be able to prove that you are the successor trustee with authority to sign for the trust. Well, the certification is really more of an affidavit. So you'll be signing an affidavit through escrow to say that you certify that this is a true copy of the trust. If you have a family member, if it's your mom and dad, if you are the heir of the estate, you probably need to have these conversations. They're not comfortable, but you need to have them and say, hey, mom and dad, do you have your property recorded in the name of a trust? And where is your trust? Can I have a copy of it? Because that's something you want to be able to identify and be able to have access to in the event that the worst case scenario happens. And if they don't have a trust, then you can start those conversations now to help them find resources to set up a trust. But having those conversations at, when it's appropriate and at your earliest opportunity, it is figuring out where to find the copies of the trust. Because sometimes there have been amendments that have happened over the years.
Yes.
Just because you have a trust set up, you could go to an attorney and set up a trust and notarize that trust and have a copy of it. And it's wonderful and it's all well thought out, but it's worth nothing unless you get your property recorded in the name of the trust. So
Right. So
there's
tell
another
us,
vehicle.
so tell us about that. So
Yeah,
what happens? How does that work?
that is typically done through a quitclaim deed. So if my property is in my name, Noelle Longmeyer, and I want to put it in the Longmeyer Trust, I would have to have a quitclaim deed prepared and take that down to the county recorder's office. You need the legal description of your property where it has all the parcel maps and all of that. And
Mm.
realtors like myself and you can help you identify that legal description. You could have an attorney prepare it. You can have the escrow officer prepare it, a title officer prepare it. Typically, it's not very expensive. And then you go down to the county recorder's office, and then they record that transfer from your personal name into the trust name. And that is what makes it legally under the name of the trust. That's called funding the trust with an asset.
And sometimes, because most people have an attorney who prepares a trust for them, is that fair to say?
They typically, the attorney, when they prepare the trust, they will typically be the one that does prepare that deed, and they can have it recorded for you. But a lot of times, if you've had a trust and you've sold a property and you buy a new property, a lot of times people buy property in their personal names because of financing. So lenders say, and lenders don't love that you're going to finance under the name of a trust because the trust is a different entity. They want to finance under your personal social security numbers. So they have you purchase as individuals, and then it is your responsibility to then record the property in the name of the trust after you close escrow.
Right. So it's one of those little details, but it generally, if you have an attorney who's helping you, he or she generally will help you with the recording, but that is something
Yes.
that's very important. Well, what do you have for advice for families who are navigating their emotions when they're selling a loved one's home? We know that that's always difficult. Probably it's also very difficult when there's siblings and more
Yeah.
than one family member. And
Anytime you have to sell a property where someone has passed, it's always a very emotional journey for those families. And if you are the professional on the other end, you want to be kind of a guiding, empathetic resource to help people stay on task in a loving way, but provide palatable little chunks where they can handle it. Sometimes throwing everything that they have to do at them at once is a little daunting and overwhelming. So kind of setting out a path is how I like to approach things with the family and say, like, what are our first steps? We need to talk about maybe preparing the home first before we talk about marketing and pricing the property and all those things. And, some of the things I know that you specialize in and have a lot of experience in is helping families identify transition specialists, who will come out and help declutter properties, estate
right.
sale companies to help maybe thin out some of the volume of what they have to go through. And emotionally, sometimes families are not ready to do that right off the bat. So it is something that, you have to be very respectful of in just providing resources and hoping to help them set, reasonable deadlines or points on a calendar that they can kind of know that that's looming in the background to hold themselves accountable to help move forward in the process, because it's very easy to get frozen and not take any action. So if you are constantly there to help provide resources and projections of dates where, it's reasonable and loving in the same way that you say, like, why don't we take 30 days to, you know, meet with a few of professionals? Why don't we take 60 days? Why don't we, set a date on the calendar that you feel comfortable with? But it's really important to have some of those calendared out dates because it just helps people move forward rather than get frozen.
Yeah, and some people just can't deal with it at all. And
That's
then
true.
there are some people, in the case, we had a family member that passed away, and one of our siblings just wanted everything solved. Like, if she could have solved it in 30 minutes later, that would have been fine with her. So
Yeah.
you have people in all.
Well, and yeah, it's hard when you have two different siblings, that might be the co-trustees, and they have to come to an agreement about how to move forward. If you have co-trustees, you have to have buy-in from all parties, and one person's grieving process could be totally different than the other person's grieving process. And that's incredibly difficult to navigate. But, there's that's why you have to make sure that you know all of the different people who are involved. And sometimes it's part of that conversation when I do an initial consultation with a family who's going through this. It's asking if they have other family members who can support them in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it is not easy. And as I said, then when you have blended families and new wives who weren't the moms and new husbands
Yep.
who weren't the dads and two sets of siblings from different parents, and it's very challenging. Let's talk about your role, the role of a trusted real estate expert advisor in this kind of a transaction. What's some of the specific knowledge that a real estate agent, a realtor in your position should have when handling trust sales?
Well, I think it's important to understand that you, as a real estate professional, should also be able to review a copy of the trust. Because a lot of times people will tell you that they're the authorized party to sell a property, and they're not necessarily the only authorized party that has to be involved. So, to that point, as an estate sales special or a trust sales specialist, you really need to be able to kind of understand and read contracts, read trusts, and be able to identify who the co-trustees or the successor trustees, whether it's singular, whether it's multiple, who those parties are, and you need to be able to ask for a copy of the trust. You need to be comfortable with asking for that, just like you would have to check, anything else about why, who's on title, whether it's a husband or wife. It's the same thing. You need to ask who the legal trustees are, and you need to be armed with the knowledge of how to help them move forward with knowing that you have to order the death certificates, knowing that they're going to have to set up that bank account in the name of the trust, knowing how to help point them towards the resources of applying for the tax ID number, having those resources available so that they don't have to go research and figure all those things out at the same time that they're navigating this very difficult journey, and providing those resources so that they're at their fingertips. That's really where the role of, someone who is an experienced trust sale expert can make all the difference.
So if I was interviewing, or our audience was interviewing someone or looking for the right real estate professional to help them in a situation like this, what questions should they be asking, or how would they know? Because if someone doesn't have, let's say, for example, you and I live in another state and our parents live here in California, and we need to handle something here. We don't know any real estate
Right.
professionals. So you look online, you look on Zillow, or you look online and, who's a realtor in Long Beach, California, and somebody's name pops up. How do you know whether they really are the right one to handle this kind of a situation or not?
I think one of the good questions, if you're going to be screening professionals, if you are selling a property under the name of a trust and you have a trust, if you're a successor trustee or a parent has passed away, one of those questions is based on experience, is asking the agent that you're interviewing, what has been your experience in selling homes under the name of a trust? How many sales have you done through trusts? Do you have any professional affiliations with trust organizations or trust attorneys for that matter? For instance, like I joined the Estate Planning Council of Long Beach so that I could really understand some of the ins and outs and potential exposure points that my clients are going to run into when it comes to setting up trusts and selling properties under the name of a trust. So, really digging in, you should be asking people what their level of experience is in the trust realm. And especially if there's contentiousness with trusts. Have they had any experience with having to navigate that? Do they have trust attorneys that can help them navigate that? Because sometimes the original attorney that drafts the trust, they may not even be around anymore.
Yeah, they might be retired or passed away or something.
Correct. Believe me, it's happened to me on multiple occasions. So making sure that the person that you're interviewing has good resources for them to be able to reach out to in the event that they need someone to help navigate. Because sometimes it does show up where siblings end up getting into some kind of a dispute over
Oh,
how the
yes,
trust is going to be
it
carried out.
does. Yes,
Yes.
it does.
And
Yeah.
having legal resources to help them mediate those issues is a huge benefit.
Then how does it differ when you're working with the attorneys or the trustees or the financial advisors from just a traditional buyer and seller situation? When it's not probate, do you still get involved with those professionals, with the attorneys and the financial advisors?
You can, but I'll say this, and I say this to all the clients that I'm working with. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a
Mm.
legal professional. And so when someone does have a question about whether or not that, a certain point of the trust should be honored or not honored, it's not going to be me that answers that question. So that's when you do end up having to reach out to legal resources or refer legal resources. And one of the things I like to do is, if I'm going to be representing a client and we determine that there is, a commission rate, I might even say I'll rebate like $500 for a consultation for an attorney if there's
Oh,
some
how smart.
contentiousness, because they need to consult with a professional attorney. That's not my role to help them navigate
Yeah.
how that contract is supposed to be carried out. I'm just there to facilitate and provide resources through that process. But that will be a support to help people, reach out to the appropriate professional to answer those questions.
That's really a good idea. We were talking about that on another earlier call today about serving seniors and the challenges that come up. And even if you may have a trust, that doesn't mean it can't be contested later on.
Correct.
So it's very important to make sure that that everything is covered. Well, are there any legal or financial pitfalls that sellers should be aware of when they're selling their home in a trust? Anything that you've run into that you wish they had known first?
Well, the legal pitfalls can be in regard to how the trust was written. Sometimes, like I mentioned earlier, sometimes people there's been errors or something has occurred where even not intentionally, someone hasn't recorded the property in the name of the trust, or they've done, additional purchases, or God forbid, they did a refinance and didn't put the property back into the name of the trust
Oh,
after the refinance.
oh, and I'm
And
sure that
then
happens so
it
much.
happens all the time. So when issues come up, there can be incredible financial risks
Um,
to people involved in that. But there is a way sometimes to still sell and avoid the full probate process. But you need a good attorney to help you figure out how to file the appropriate paperwork to still sell, showing that it was intended to be put in the trust. The quality of your trust is very important. And there's certain trusts that have what we call kind of a catch-all addendum that allows you to have a little bit more gray area so that it just, it basically shows intent, that you intend for any future properties or for this property to always be in the name of the trust, whether you took it out and forgot to put it back in for certain reasons. There are addendums that really good attorneys use as what we call kind of this catch-all addendum. And it has saved several of my clients bacon when something has, popped up, because there are things that happen. There are refinances that happen. There are issues that come up.
yeah, absolutely. And I'm not sure I would have thought about that in advance. Certainly, we all think of it afterwards.
Yeah.
But I've done, as a mortgage professional, I've done thousands of refinances, and I'm not sure I always remembered that. And even in our own case, I'm sitting here thinking, okay, well, when was the last time we refinanced? I better call my husband after this and
I
say, did
know.
we put it back in the trust?
Yeah, you can always, it's very, because you and I are real estate professionals, it's very easy for your real estate professional to do a quick title check. So if you are in doubt, for any of your listeners, if you're like, oh my gosh, did I forget to put my property back in the name of the trust after I refinanced? Um, Probably no one's refinanced in the last 18 months, honestly.
No, we
But
haven't, but certainly we may
but
have
back in
before.
the back maybe 2-3 years ago, when the interest rates were really low, a lot of people refinanced, and the craze of that market meant sometimes people didn't put it back in their trust. So you can check with your real estate professional, and we can do a quick title check with our title officers for a history of the deeds to see that that property is legally still vested in the name of your trust. So I highly recommend that if you're doubtful.
Sure, and I'm sitting here thinking that I should be reaching out to my clients, to the
Yes.
people whose homes I've sold or been involved in their mortgages, and remind them that this is something they should be doing.
Yeah, and remind them about the whole thing about the trust and the homeowners insurance. I did a whole video on that too, because I heard the same thing, and I called my parents, who had just recently moved. They sold their home and moved into their forever home, um, and I wanted to make sure that their homeowners insurance policy was in the name of their trust.
Yes, absolutely. These are things that fortunately we learn on calls like this. So thank you for bringing that to everyone's attention. So for our viewers and our listeners, remember to check the title. If your name was in a trust, you refinance, put it back in the trust. And number two is make sure your insurance and anything else that you're licensed for your home, like a short-term rental or whatever, that all of that is taken care of the way that it should be. And while we're still on that subject, so if someone is listening to this, they're saying, oh my gosh, I need to do that. Should they go back to their trust attorney? How do they make sure it's back in the name of the trust?
They don't have to go to the attorney. The attorney might be a more expensive route, but you certainly could. You could go to an escrow company who can maybe charge you a nominal fee to prepare a quitclaim deed to put the property back in the name of the trust.
Okay.
And they just record it with the local county recorder's office through their title company.
And maybe their attorney who initially prepared their trust might have a service to them,
Yes, yeah.
right? That he
It's not,
charges, some
yeah, it
nominal
doesn't have to be
fee.
a crazy expensive process.
Sure, sure. Well,
I
everyone
will say,
remember to do
I
that.
just recorded something at the county recorder's office in Norwalk for the county of Los Angeles. And there's a new thing now for any property documents that are recorded. They've slapped on a $75 surcharge to
Of course they have.
everything. It's not like
Yeah.
a $26 fee to record.
We've lost you.
Oh, me?
We did. So let's go back to it's not the $26. Let's check. Let's do that again.
So it's no longer, it used to be just a $26 service fee or recording fee to record a quitclaim deed at the county of Los Angeles recorder's office. And now it's like $95 because there's a surcharge on top of that they've
Of course.
attached to all property documents that are being recorded.
Of course, of course, of course, of course. And be sure. We've said this before. I'm going to say it again. I might say it one more time before this show is over. Remember to check the tax implications before you do anything with the title of your home or add anyone to the title of your home specifically.
Yeah, please consult a CPA. And a lot of it, it's not maybe even the immediate tax consequences. It could be something that affects you after the fact. So let me give you an example. Let's say, for instance, that you add your son to title and you want to protect him so that way you're joint tenants on title. And yes, it's true that upon your passing, your surviving joint tenant will retain the 100% of title at that point.
Mm-hmm.
However, it's more of a big deal about when they go to sell the property down the road. So if you had not added your son and you ended up passing away and you had your property in the name of a trust, your son would then be able to take over as the successor trustee and sell that property. And the property upon your passing would have been completely stepped up in value basis. So he would be able to sell that property and it would be revalued at the whatever the value was at the time of your death. But if you put him on title, he doesn't get that step up in basis. So when he sells the property, it's based on what your original basis was of when you purchased the property. And he doesn't get that step up in tax basis. So he's going to be exposed to a significant amount of capital gains.
Oh. Okay, so tell us again. Everyone listen to this. Noelle's going to tell us again. Our viewers and our listeners.
And again, I'm not an accountant.
Not an accountant or an attorney, but we're going to listen to this one more time.
Okay. So if you have your property in a trust and you pass away and your child is your successor trustee, your adult child is your successor trustee, they can sell the property. And when they sell the property, they're going to be able to take advantage of what we call a full step up in value basis. So they're going to be, when you pass, the property is revalued based on what the value was at the time of your passing. So let's use some numbers here. Let's say you bought the property for $100,000 40 years ago, and now it's worth $1 million.
Yeah,
and
that's realistic.
Very realistic. So if you pass away now, your son, let's say your son was the heir of the property, and if they're going to revalue your property at $1 million. So if he sells within a reasonable period of time and that property is still about $1 million, there is no gain. He will not experience any gain that would be taxable. because it was under the property, under the trust, and there's a full step up in value basis. However, if you didn't have a trust and you added him as a joint tenant, he doesn't have that step up in value basis to the full degree. He only gets a 50% step up in basis because he was a joint tenant. So he doesn't see the difference in his. So that difference between, if he's going to now sell at $1 million and you purchased it for $100,000, instead of getting that full step up to $1 million, it's only going to be a 50% step up. And now he's going to have to potentially be exposed to capital gains on the difference. And capital gains is incredibly expensive.
Yes.
So, I mean, that's one of those things that you have to think about. What are the potential tax exposures down the road?
Right. So one of my questions was, are there any common financial mistakes that people make? And this certainly would be one.
That's
That
one.
certainly would be one. That certainly would be one. Can you give us an example? You've worked with so many people, Noelle, of a story that you've helped through a trust sale and how having an expert agent really made a big difference in that situation?
Yeah, fortunately, I'll give you two stories. One of them actually just very recently. I'm currently in an escrow right now where the family made sure that their mother, who was very astute in putting her property in a trust, so they made sure it was all up to date and everything had been funded correctly and everything was in that trust. And it was a very emotional situation. She was passing
Oh,
from, a difficult disease. She'd been ill. They were taking care of her.
um,
And the last thing that they wanted to do was deal with probate. And the other part of that was, the house had to be cleaned out. And because of the grief, it's not something that they wanted to deal with directly. And as a professional, I stepped in and was able to kind of just take on all of that for them. I set up the meeting with the estate sale companies. I provided access for the estate sale to set up and do that. I provided access to, get everything ready to prepare the home. And they didn't have to go through the probate process, which would have forced them to do a lot of that on their own and over a longer period of time. And now they're in a position to be able to just move on more comfortably and take time grieving the loss rather than having to deal with the, very difficult task of doing all of these things while having a full-time job, while raising kids. Families don't grieve in a vacuum, and having
yeah.
to take on everything else that comes with selling a property, especially one where, they have 30, 40 years in a property and the property's full of their family things. Once they've had an opportunity to go through it, they don't want to have to deal with disposing of the rest of the items. They don't know what to do. They don't know what resource they have, and that's not their priority. So that's been one very recent experience I've had. And another was a really devastating example of why it's so important to put your property in a trust. I helped some clients. This was probably about 15 years ago. And they were a very loving couple, an older couple that had a young child. The wife was a little bit younger and she had a young child. The gentleman was in his 60s, and they purchased the property. And sometimes in purchasing the property, only one spouse can be on the loan. Maybe the other spouse doesn't have enough established credit. Maybe there's some reasons for that. But it was intended to be community property in a trust. They had sent me emails saying, and I had reminded them, remember, you talked about putting your property in a trust. Oh, yes, we're going to do that. And maybe within 3 months after they purchased this property, he died suddenly of a massive heart attack.
Oh my gosh.
And that was just not only the tragedy of losing him, his wife then had to deal with what they were going to do. He was the sole breadwinner. She wasn't on the title to the property. And because of our
Oh,
exchanges, we were able to take that to an attorney who actually helped to get her full authority to sell the property without having to go to court confirmation through probate.
oh
But
my
it
gosh.
took the relationships that I had with the attorneys and the knowledge of having those conversations back and forth with my clients that actually helped her circumvent the probate process. And the English was her second language. She didn't speak
Oh my
English very
gosh.
well. So having to navigate all of this at the same time was just so devastating to her. But it was one of the reasons why I became a trust sales specialist, was to help people avoid this going forward because of that worst case scenario situation.
And imagine if she hadn't had you.
I don't know what would have happened. She ended up moving back to the Philippines after they were able to sell the property, and she had enough money, even though it was only like 4 or 5 months after by the time we sold it, 4 or 5 months after the time that they had actually purchased it, we were able to get enough there to help her move back to the Philippines to be with her family there.
And these are the times when you can definitely say that who you work with matters.
Yeah.
Who
I
you
like to
work
think
with
so.
matters, both on on our level and also the attorneys or so forth. What would you say is the most challenging situation you've dealt with? If that's not it, is there another one that's
Oh yeah.
really
Um,
difficult?
it's the most challenging situation I've ever had was in regard to a trust where I did have to have an attorney step in because it was very, very difficult to mitigate the emotional issues and the anger between siblings.
Oh my,
There's a lot, it's a very emotional time,
it is.
and sometimes it brings out the worst in people. Even, we don't know how we're going to respond sometimes until we're in that situation. And these were not people I knew. They had been referred to me. But one of the siblings had been a caretaker of the mother who passed away and was living in the home. And it was her only home. It was the only home she'd known for I mean, she'd lived there since she grew up and had been caring for her mom. And so the idea or the prospect of selling that home was incredibly emotionally difficult for her. And the other sibling was out of state, and it was out of sight, out of mind, wanting to just move on and not have to have that as anything else that needed to be checked off her list of things that needed to be done. And it was very contentious. But we did have a very good trust attorney that was able to help them mediate their concerns and their issues. And we figured out a path forward, but it wasn't without an incredible amount of emotion to
Mm.
navigate.
So terribly sad when you see that happen.
Yeah.
I think one of the most unfortunate and certainly one of the saddest things I see is when someone passes away and a spouse is left, like your client you mentioned,
Yeah.
a situation not being taken care of and saying, I never paid the bills.
Yeah.
I don't know where anything is. I don't know where the passwords are. I
Yeah.
don't know what bank accounts we have, or either whether it's a husband or a wife, could be either.
Right.
And one of them then is put in a position where they make decisions on what we call a crisis-based decision, not an
Yes.
information-based decision. And
Yes.
sometimes they get good advice, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they could stay in their home if they had someone like you to guide them, maybe a reverse mortgage or something, that
Yeah.
they could stay in their home. They wouldn't have to move. Um, and
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. I'm sure you approach clients the same way. I'm not there to just sell a house, and whether they sell the house or not, that's okay with me. I'd like them to know all the resources available to them. And to that point, sometimes it doesn't make sense to sell the property. Sometimes it makes more sense to stay and do a reverse mortgage. And it actually might be a better long-term decision for the heirs if there is a surviving spouse, rather than sell that property at that time, even if it's difficult for that spouse to stay in that property emotionally, there are ways to rent that property. There are ways to look at that, but there are tax implications that you have to think about. So it's really looking at it from a bigger picture about what's best for that family and what do they want.
right.
How can we come to a consensus about what's the best path to move forward?
Or maybe sell it and then take the money to buy another one on a reverse mortgage so they don't have a payment. They
Correct.
don't have a
Yeah.
mortgage payment. And that's
Yeah.
another way that they can still not be thrown into a rental situation or a situation where they have to live with someone else. And again, it matters. Who you work with matters. When you're in these situations and people know you, but they don't know who else is available, what kind of resources, either an attorney or CPA or financial planner, what other kind of resources do they need, and how do you help them find those?
So the two primary resources that I typically refer out to are different estate planning professional, so a trust attorney or an estate planning attorney, to help them navigate some of the questions that come up during the process. I have a couple of really, really great attorneys that I have referred to that I personally have used. And then always a really good CPA, someone who is not just a regular CPA that does taxes for maybe like H&R Block. There's nothing wrong with, accountants that do things like that, but people who really understand and specialize in what the tax exposures are in regard to capital gains, inheritance tax. There's some other things that come up when you're settling estates. So a good CPA that has experience working with these types of issues. And then some of the other vendors, like I mentioned, an estate sale company. A lot of times an estate sale company or a decluttering, a transition specialist. And specifically, I have found there's a couple of great resources for seniors specifically, where there are moving companies that
Yes.
specialize in this kind of transition. And
Yes.
they are just a godsend. They don't just look at it as a move. They understand the volume and the emotional aspect and everything that comes with it. And it is a completely different experience to work with that type of a moving company versus someone you might just hire off of like 5-star movers. It's a very different experience for a senior that's going from a home that they may have owned for 30, 40, 50 plus years, and that process.
It's interesting that you bring that up because we talked about that this morning on another call, and we interviewed a moving company expert earlier on one of our shows, and his company has a division that works with seniors.
I
Because if
highly
you
recommend
just
that.
call a moving company, they have no idea. And the movers
Yeah.
might get there and that person says, I can't move today. I changed my mind, or I don't want to move that piano, or I don't want to move this, or
Yeah.
I don't want to do that, or emotionally, I just emotionally can't handle it.
Yeah.
Or they've got a child who calls and says, oh, no, don't give my piano away, right?
Yeah.
And the value of having the right moving company
Yeah. And the
is so
sensitivity factor is a big deal. And it makes all the difference in
huge,
having that sensitivity factor there.
huge. We have just 1 minute left. If you could leave our viewers and our listeners with one piece of advice, what would that be?
If you don't have a trust, the cost of waiting is going to be more expensive for your family members than you'll ever understand. So think about making sure that you set up a trust and fund your property in a trust. And if you do have a trust, make sure you have conversations with your loved ones about where that trust is, who the executor is, who the successor trustee is. They're uncomfortable conversations, but they're necessary, and they will definitely serve your loved ones so much more than if you don't have them.
Noelle's information is going to be at the bottom of our screen, so you can reach her. She's in California, in Southern California. You can serve all of California. Is that correct?
Yes, I typically specialize in the greater Long Beach area, Northwest Orange County, and the South Bay.
But as with Noelle, we have a network of professionals across the country. So if you have a loved one, a mom or a dad, or you are the senior and you have children in other parts of the country, we can help you. Be sure, because we've learned today again that who you work with matters. Noelle, thank you so much for being with us. What an insightful conversation. Thank you for
Valerie.
sharing your knowledge, your expertise on trust sales. It's such an important topic. And I know that our listeners and our viewers have learned a lot. So stay tuned. Come back next Monday for another episode of Always Ageless. Be sure to follow, subscribe, and share with us. Remember to age is not growing old, it's just being bold. And until next time, take care, keep thriving, and be bold. And come back next week to Always Ageless.
Thank you, Valerie.
Thank you for being with us.